Today I am in Provo, Utah at the Brigham Young University College of Law, speaking with David A. Thomas, who is the Rex E. Lee Endowed Chair and Professor of Law Emeritus at the university and at the J. Reuben Clark Law School of the university. David taught here from 1974 until his retirement a few years ago in 2010. In addition to his teaching role, David served as a law librarian from 1974 until 1990. David, with that by way of introduction, could we begin by you telling us a little bit about what life was like when you were young and today?
Well, thank you, Pat. I'm not sure I can reach back quite far to when life was was young, but
well, those of us who get a little older, maybe it's farther back than we once had. But well, that means you have all these marvelous memories.
But I do recall being quite young when I began my teaching and library career here. I had just turned 30. I'd been out of law school for 2 years. I don't think I brought a lot to the table, particularly as a teacher. But I always thought of myself as the kid. And I still thought of myself as the kid nearly 40 years later when I retired. But it was a good ride. I had a number of challenges, but a number of really interesting things to do and to learn. And I think professionally it was important for me to have an academic component to my career. And when I was hired as the law librarian at the law school, I replaced someone who had been on just a few months. So I was essentially engaged in the startup phases of the law library here, and that was a really exciting time for a new school that aspired to be a good and a leading school, and saw its library as a component of that effort. So we had opportunities, and we had resources that normally we would not have had under those circumstances. So in addition to that library appointment, I also wanted to be able to teach, and I asked if I could teach and if they would be eager for me to teach, and they said yes. So I tried to both be a full-time librarian and also a full-time teacher, and I did that. Probably went over the top in a couple of years after starting, when it seemed appropriate, maybe even essential, that I get my master's degree in library science. There was an accredited and a large library school here at the university at the time. So in addition to full-time library work and full-time teaching, I embarked on a part-time graduate study course leading to an MLS degree.
You were a bit of a glutton for punishment, it sounds like, David.
I think that, fortunately, the library degree program was accomplished in a couple of years, and life returned somewhat to normal. But I'm sure my work in every phase suffered a bit by that. In any event, eventually I was degreed, credentialed, and continued the exciting work that we were involved in. And as you yourself remember, it was a time when we were in the transition into a more technological era. And one of our big efforts was to do retrospective conversions of our card catalogs.
You were well out ahead of the rest of us, actually. You say we were in that time. We were getting into that time, most of us. You folks were there. I remember you had a conference here one time, many years ago. And I came, as did many of us, of your colleagues who aspired to do the sorts of things that you were already doing. And it was an eye-opener to see some of the stuff you were able to do. In those days, we were using the old clunky dedicated terminals to access Lexis, but not here. You had people, students who had their own computers, or computers that you provided, that any one of which could be used to do that. And that became the norm a few years later, but you were out ahead of the pack, and it's really fascinating to watch what you were up to.
Well, thank you for that memory and that perspective. One thing I do recall is that I think we were the first academic law library to have completed the retrospective conversion of its catalog. we were ahead of even of our university library. Of course, we had a smaller task to do.
But still a daunting task nonetheless.
It was at the time.
Yeah.
We had to create, invent some things in order to get it done. And we realized that there is a price to be paid for any kind of pioneering effort, and that is that you do a lot of trial and error stuff and stops and starts, and then those who come behind can take advantage of your experience and be a lot more efficient in getting there. And that's good too.
Well, I'm glad you put it that way. I don't feel so guilty now.
No, no.
Because we did learn from the trials of other places, including here. And you did certain things, and you changed other ways of doing it. We monitored what those all were. You were, sharing, and so we didn't have to reinvent a few of the same wheels over the years.
And the satisfaction of being first has to remain mostly internal, because there are so many more phases of progress that quickly succeed that it becomes almost irrelevant that who got there first. Everybody's working in it together.
Well, another factor is in these early days we didn't have the interconnectability that we have through the internet now.
Right.
So a lot of what you were doing, we couldn't just call it up and take a look at it, as became more of a possibility later on.
And that is a particularly apt comment with respect to cataloging. So.
Yes.
So
how could we live without online catalogs today?
Right.
And utilities like OCLC and
right.
so
The
on that just
interconnectivity.
connect it all together for everybody.
Yeah.
It's just wonderful.
In fact, we almost made catalogers an extinct species because others were doing it faster and better. So.
Well, I know that our catalogers, some of them, when I was at Yale, we had OCLC came in there. We all went over to the Sterling Library to see this thing in operation. And some of the catalogers were concerned on the way back and muttering that maybe their jobs were not as secure as they had thought. It didn't happen. I mean, they became so much, it empowered them to do so much more. And in different ways, but the jobs were secure, maybe not quite as they were used to doing them, but one has to move with the times, as they say.
Yeah. Well, it was a heady time for many of us, and if you were not in a brand new school such as we were, you were probably in a relatively new school at the time. That was just an era when many schools were coming online. During that time, I tried to contribute in my academic role as well as in my library role, publishing and teaching courses. My main teaching efforts were in the first year courses of property and civil procedure, and I taught in both of those areas and published in those areas in the early days. And I had my what we call tenure here, continuing faculty status, in 1979, which was 5 years after I started here. And it was also found that the library part was a really rich part of the environment. It's the part that got me out all over the country into the meetings and the offices of wonderful colleagues such as yourself.
Thank you.
And so that I felt like I was virtually with all law library directors in law schools across the country on a first-name basis, and I loved that.
Well, there were
So
only
much
at the time maybe about 180 of us, and
Yeah.
and we did get to know each other.
We did.
Even in the days before we had email and so on, we'd network at meetings and conferences.
Yeah.
That was just the way it was.
And it could be time-consuming if you got into a chapter leadership, for instance, or a special interest section. And if you were the head person, you did most of the work. So that's just the way it worked.
How did you guess?
And sometimes you got recycled and did it again.
And in those early days, even at the national level, at ELL, the volunteer elected leaders and committee people and so on did most of the work then. I mean, we didn't have the staff support that we developed later on.
Yeah. One of the AAL meetings, I think it was the one in Reno, I was in charge of volunteer work. Probably 1980 or something, one of those.
It was
83,
around, it
yeah.
was, I know Babe Russo, the longtime sort of one-person staff at AELL was still there, and I can still remember you all had us to a rodeo nearby, or a
Yeah.
rodeo-type show.
Right, over the protests of some.
Oh, I'm sure. There were the animal concerns about some of those animals, perhaps how they're treated, but from what I understand, they're pretty good to the animals in reality. But I can still remember, again, Babe Russo and the president of the association riding in a stagecoach and having to step out in what was fairly muddy environment. We all got sort of a laugh out of that situation.
And I still remember Reno proclaiming itself to be the biggest little town in the country.
They still do.
And they have a railroad running right through the middle of downtown and all of that. So those were fun times. Yeah. They still stick in my memory here 30 plus years later. And that was a very rich part of my life.
Well, you know, you talk about becoming a director around the age of 30. That was not too uncommon for our generation. Mm-hmm. A lot of the...
we were peers, weren't we?
We were, yeah. You and I were just about exactly the same point in all of these developments. And the people who'd been the directors were often, had come out of World War II and moved into the field, or had come as refugees from Europe primarily, and had become law librarians here. They were legal scholars in their own right in Europe, but they couldn't practice in those days in this country. So they aspired to academic life, and many of them to law librarianship.
And they had a gravitas about them, I think, because of that, exactly as you described. And we were top-heavy with men.
Well, that was true.
Director positions at the time.
That was true, yeah.
That has now changed.
I remember many of our women colleagues of that era used to refer to that in terms that were as flattering as they should have been. Maybe they were accurate that, you know, the guys coming out of library school went into directorships, and the women had to go through lower level positions for a while. And then some of them became very excellent directors. And,
right.
and as you say, that has changed, and rightly so.
Yeah. One somewhat unique aspect of my library career, unique to me at least, was that I began to branch out internationally. And some of my academic research interests were taking me particularly to the British Isles and to Germany, where I had served as a Mormon missionary quite a few years ago. That's been 50 years ago now. So I had the language background, and I was doing research and writing on the origins of the common law, which took me into Anglo-Saxon law, which took me to North Germany, which was where I had been, and it was all very interesting. But I got involved with the British and Irish Association of Law Librarians.
Oh, wonderful group of colleagues.
And I was essentially the American representative to that group. That was before the AALL presidents discovered that they could take my place.
Fortunately, they discovered it before my time, because Carol, my wife, and I were both over there. It was our first trip to the UK.
Yeah.
I was the president and the representative at that time. And there were a number of Americans there. Carol Billings was there,
yes.
Jim Heller. We were planning a joint group of conferences with BIO, the Canadian Association, and of course AELL. And so there were several of us there. Also, one of the vendors came, Phil Cohen, who owned Oceana, who had actually grown up in the city where our meeting was in the UK that year. And he was in his last few years, and he was sort of reconnecting to his past.
Yeah.
It was wonderful to see him and the others. And that was a very nice group. It was,
well, I got involved in the early 80s. My first trip was 81, but I don't think I went to the conference then. And went through 89, I think. And I was, shortly after I started attending, appointed as the AALL representative. And then that stopped when the AALL decided that its president should be the representative. But
Some smart president coming along.
I thought this was a really
included you
job.
out as the volunteer. That's not nice, but still.
Yeah, I continued to attend, and I was usually giving presentations when I went, and developed a very cordial group of colleagues overseas from that. And in fact, the end of my representation time, I was awarded a life membership at BILL, which I still enjoy.
Yeah.
I don't know, I keep wanting to donate something to cover the postage costs and that sort of thing, but that was a lovely aspect of.
Well, you may have noticed that in AALL itself, if you are a retired member now, you do donate, in effect, you pay small dues, but it was costed out what it essentially cost to service those memberships, and that's where the dues have been set.
The British haven't quite gotten to that point.
Neither has the Law Librarian Society of Washington, D.C., because they made me a no dues owed life member after I retired.
Wonderful.
From there.
So spin-offs from that, I did one panel, I think at the Reno meeting, where I had a couple of Brits and a German discussing some topic that was relevant to their expertise. In 1986, I organized a study conference at Oxford. It was very well attended by both Americans and British, in my own particular areas of interest. We were at Oxford and London. So we had a lot of fun with that.
Do you know Jules Winterton?
Yeah.
Yeah. He essentially is in your role in reverse now, I think, because he comes to the annual meetings here at AALL, and did, in fact, this summer when it was in San Antonio. And we were able to talk to him on camera for this series, this history. And it was wonderful. But he, as far as I can tell, I don't know if he's volunteer, whether the association helps fund this or what it is, but he's de facto the bio representative to the ALL meetings.
Well, that's
seems
good.
Every year now.
The British are big on bursaries because their private resources are not quite as generous as our own. So,
from what I'm hearing, some of our own are not as generous as they once were either. This, shall we say, difficult times that we're in.
With the passage of time, most of the leading lights in bio have now passed away or passed into retirement or into other things.
Yeah.
So it's a different world there now.
Probably so. Well, why don't we sort of back up? We've been talking about some of your adventures as a law librarian. Why don't we ask for a few of the other sort of standard questions that I like to ask in these conversations. Outside of work, well, now you're retired, do you have any hobbies, passions, other pursuits that you'd like to mention?
Well, I think I've never been very good at recreation. When I have recreated, and traveling has been kind of something I've enjoyed doing, especially driving trips, it's usually been combined with something else, and it's probably something you've been acquainted with as well, where you like to drive someplace because you're going to attend a meeting there. And when I attend meetings, I love to go walking around neighborhoods because I am, after all, a property professor, and I learn a lot when I just go into neighborhoods. Photography has been not exactly a passion, but something I've enjoyed. It's a reason for going someplace sometimes, or it's something I get out of being someplace. Quite a bit of my landscape photography work has been hanging here in the law school, and I'm almost a little embarrassed about that now, since nobody knows who I am anymore.
Well, you've been retired about 3 or 4 years.
4 years, right.
Memories do change
They
very
do
rapidly in law schools.
Yeah.
I used to take advantage of that. As a director of the library, you basically make some change and you take heat for a year or so, and then within 2 or 3 years, no one remembered what it was like before the change.
Yeah.
That was very handy on occasion.
So those kinds of things, I love family history now. Genealogy is a big thing in our Latter-day Saint culture, and we have the world's largest genealogical library. And that
Oh,
sort of
I
thing.
have
And
actually
you know
had
that,
some
so-
access to that
Right.
through Ancestry.com.
Yeah, yeah, and it's freely available to the public around the world.
Yeah.
I have a large family,
Mhm.
8 children, 20th grandchild is on the way now.
Wow.
And some of them, the majority of them are within visiting distance here. I do have a family in Canada and a family in Texas and a family in Las Vegas.
Well, reasons for a little road trip, perhaps. I don't know,
Yeah.
maybe that's a little farther than you want to do it, but
Yeah, this is not the show and tell time, but we get together every 2 years, and this was summer before
pull
this
that
past
back
one.
closer to that there. That
Is
should
that
show
where-
up. Yeah, so that's the clan. I don't know if that's
That's
the right
all
word.
the children and grandchildren
Yeah.
at the moment, so.
Ah.
And our oldest daughter will be 46.
Uh-huh.
She was a Rhodes Scholar, so we took advantage of her 3 years in Oxford to visit her quite a bit.
Oh, what a marvelous
Yeah.
excuse. Not that you needed one, but.
She's a published author, a mother of 4 children, and so she is the Canadian now. She lives there. Her husband's an attorney in Canada. So I won't go through the whole family, but each family presents a very interesting situation for us that enriches our lives in the things they do professionally and personally. So that's a big part of it.
Yeah, it's interesting as they grow up, you always wonder what they will become and whether they will be successful and whether they'll even survive childhood in some ways, unscathed.
Well put. Yeah.
And as you say, when they get into their middle years, you know, you as a parent have done your job.
Right. And the fact that there are more of them doesn't mean that we give them any less attention than, for instance, you are 2. You just sort of expand the bag a little bit, dig more deeply.
I find I expand for myself in that I have nephews and nieces, and now grandnephews and nieces coming along, and so the family is bigger than it once was in that
That's right.
sense.
Right. And the fact that slightly removed from the immediate family doesn't change the depth of your feeling, I think. I think that's true.
Yeah.
And of course, we've added, with each married child, we've added that spouse's family into our own family circle, and those have been loving and delightful relationships as well.
Good.
We have, in recent years, care of older parents on our plate a lot. We've been the principal caregivers for my parents and my wife's parents.
Sort of the sandwich generation, I guess. Although you're probably emerging from that. You'll be the top slice of bread here in a few years, maybe. Hopefully not
And I
in the
just
wrong
say,
sense
yeah.
of that term.
It's payback time, I would say.
We took care of you when you were young. Now, as we're old, it's your turn. Step up.
As you know, from preparing for this, I've done a fair amount of professional publication, and that has resulted in a fair amount of giving of speeches at law-related meetings and expert witness work. And quite a bit of that has carried over into my retirement age as well. I was doing it a lot before I retired. I'm still doing some of it. In fact, I kept all of my publication commitments upon retirement. So every book that I had published that was still in print needed to be updated or issued in new editions. And that has continued. I've got a round of publication deadlines that kind of go through the year. I don't mean this in any boasting sense. In fact, I'm a little embarrassed about it, but I've published 13 books since I retired.
Wow.
And they've all been new editions, except for these 2 right here. And these came out a year ago, and they are originals, not new editions. And it's sort of a culmination of things I had been studying.
History of American Land Law in 2 volumes.
And the first volume is mostly English land law, because that's part of our history.
I like the pictures on them too, especially the one on the right on camera that was the old railroad engine.
Right.
Yeah.
I have a chapter here on the railroad law, and this is a full-scale working replica of one of the engines that touched cow catchers at the joining together of the Transcontinental Railroad.
Wow.
Here in northern Utah in 1869.
Now, is that picture in this area? It looks very much like the territory I've been driving through for the last few days.
It's at the north tip of the Great Salt Lake.
Is it? All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was south of there, but the land looks a lot the same.
Yeah, yeah, and it still looks like that. If you were to, it's a national monument, national historic site, and during the tourist season, they have replicas of both trains, and they run them out every day for the tourists several times a day. And the area otherwise is undeveloped, so you could get a camera angle or get a feeling for what it must have been like to be a Chinese or Irish laborer.
Now, did you take that photograph?
Yeah, I have about 50 photographs throughout the works here, and I took this one as well. This is one you may recognize as the Captain John Smith statue at Jamestown, Virginia.
Oh, okay.
Overlooking the James River.
I did not recognize it, but I should. Once down along the James, we were visiting all the old houses that were from the pre-Civil War era.
Yeah.
That are down there.
Yes, wonderful. So this, I don't have a bucket list, but if I had, this would have been on it, and now it's stricken from it.
Well, there are advantages to not have, you know, the usual array of administrative duties that many directors have, and then the teaching responsibilities of the normal classroom professors. You have time for other things, including scholarship.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you've enjoyed it immensely.
It's filled my life quite a bit.
With all the number of books you've put out since retirement in only about 4 years, it must have filled your life pretty well.
I think that my experience as a law librarian was important in the academic role as well. Again, without meaning to be at all boastful, I think I'm pretty efficient as a researcher and a writer. And that comes from intimate knowledge of the resources I've been working with. And that's the librarian aspect of my life.
Well, it's good to be organized and meet those deadlines for publishers. I had a dean many years ago who was a fairly prolific writer, in fact, very prolific and a very excellent writer in his field. But he was a little slow while he was deaning in getting his writings done because he had other things on his plate, his day job, in effect, of running a law school.
Right.
And I can remember one of our colleagues from the West Publishing Company at the time running into me at some meeting and asking me if I could intervene on his behalf. That I will not use the name, I'll say my boss was late on a manuscript, quite late.
Yeah.
And could I basically nudge him along? And I told this colleague, and I'm being very careful not to put any names in here, that I really felt very uncomfortable taking on that role, so he'd have to take a pass on that request, and he did. He understood me.
Yeah. I have found many of my colleagues to be quite cavalier about their deadlines. And I assembled a team of 30 law professors to work on the 15-volume property treatise, and that's the experience from which I draw for that last statement I made. So.
A few minutes ago, you talked about when you were a newly minted professor and director, you taught civil procedure, as I recall, among others. Yeah. But you obviously have moved into other courses over the years. Could you talk a little bit about some of your more, some of your later classroom efforts?
The civil procedure teaching and publishing activity was right at the beginning of the career, but it was simultaneous with property.
Okay.
And
so you started with property as well?
Yes, with both together. And eventually I moved more to property, and that's because of what I call a syndrome that newer law professors often opt for civil procedure as the first year course they teach, because that's what they're most familiar with coming out of practice. So I sort of stepped aside. But I kept it up. I taught from time to time, and as recently as 2007, when one of my colleagues took an unexpected leave for a position in Washington, D.C., and needed someone to teach his civil procedure course, a large section civil procedure course. I hadn't taught it for a number of years, but I was able to step in and take care of that for him and enjoyed it immensely. And then the second semester, I had the same group of students in my property course. And I said, if any of you had enough of me in the first semester, I will assist you in moving to the small section if you would like. we had a good year.
We sort of moved past a question I had for earlier that you have just now sort of alluded to. We started off with your academic career, but before you had that, you actually had graduated from law school here at BYU, and you clerked for a judge for a while, and then you were an attorney in practice for a short while. Could you talk a little bit about that era in your life?
Okay.
Just a bit.
I started law school. I went to law school at Duke, actually.
Oh.
And BYU didn't have a law school at the time. So
That's right.
I was.
I stand corrected, and I apologize for my error.
It's a little confusing because I started here as a teacher at the brand new BYU Law School. So my whole academic career has been associated with BYU. So it's certainly understandable.
Thank you for explaining my ignorance and legitimizing it.
Well, I started at Duke in the fall of 1967. I'm going to go back a little bit because there is a history that's relevant here. And Paula and I, my wife Paula and I, were newlyweds, and she started working at the law school, and I was attending. After our first year of law school, my draft notice came. It was a Provo, Utah draft board.
Oh.
And even though I was 25 years old and married, and we were expecting a baby at that point in time, I was still on their list to be drafted. So with the advice of the draft board, I came back to, we had come here for the summer between first and second years. I had work here. I went back to law school at Duke for another semester with the advice of the draft board that I could extend my time in school with an administrative appeal, which was routinely rejected. And so after 3 semesters of law school in February of '69, I entered the U.S. Army. Mm-hmm. And it eventually ended up in Vietnam. I spent a year in Vietnam. Came back after a 2-year absence back to law school. The school was very good about letting me back in. Mm-hmm. I graduated in the class of '72 instead of the class of '70. And I enjoy the affiliations with both of those classes now. And my class of 110 at Duke, 40 of us had to leave in 1 year for military service.
Wow.
And you probably remember some
Well,
of
I
the era,
remember
yeah.
the era, but my draft board in Seattle routinely did not draft anybody who was actually a full-time student, even after student deferments had been abolished. So I was fortunate. You obviously were not in your draft board.
Timing was everything.
Absolutely.
There was, and the intricacies of the draft law are not relevant anymore, but there was a time when if you took a deferment for graduate school, you could use that for 1 year, mm-hmm. and you forfeited every other deferment you might have had except for being physically unfit. So.
And you accepted liability to be drafted from age 26. It extended it to age 32.
That I don't remember.
Oh, I remember that.
Okay.
I saw that when I got my first student deferment. I realized, they can come looking for me even when I'm a little older.
So I was still in Vietnam when my second child was born. Came home to a 5-month-old who was not quite like a newborn anymore. He just filled that baby seat. So.
Well, that.
Yeah. So we returned. Before I'd left, I had interviewed for a clerkship with a Wall Street firm. It was Milbank Tweed. They had committed themselves to clerkship with me if and when I returned. Mm-hmm. And they honored that, and I was very pleased. So we spent a summer in New York, first summer back, and graduated. I had an offer to go back to them. Mm-hmm. Instead, I committed to a federal court clerkship, which you alluded to, with a fine judge here in Salt Lake. Milbank Tweed renewed their offer at the end of the clerkship, and by that time we were back here with family, and it was just too hard to go back to New York. We were convinced we could raise our family in New York, but it was just too comfortable to be here. And then I practiced. I was the first associate with a Salt Lake law firm. Uh-huh. And as my first year with them ended, the faculty positions were coming open at the brand new BYU Law School. So I was invited to give a presentation on a property law subject in August '73. Didn't hear back. Finally in September, in February, 6 months later, they contacted me and asked if I would come onto the faculty.
And this is not even a state institution, but it sounds about as bureaucratic as the state ones often are.
I don't know, but I think there was a little bit of turmoil, so that the library position had come open during that time, and they wanted their librarian also to be a full-fledged member of the faculty, and I think my desires coincided with that quite well, because I wanted to be a regular academic contributor as well, and I had some library experience from law school. As a student assistant, I was acquainted with libraries, and even before coming here, I had helped with the book selection and ordering for the library here that was, as it was being built up before the law school opened. So I probably had a foot in the door.
That must have been a very fascinating part of your career, to be building a library literally from scratch, or just about from scratch.
Yes, it was.
I'll bet you had all sorts of friends calling from the vendor community too.
We had them here. Roy Mirsky was our consultant, and I spent a couple of weeks in Austin under his tutelage, and was asked, in fact, to travel as much as I could to law libraries, law school libraries around the country. That was sort of what I alluded to earlier, as we had opportunity and resources to get around.
Did you, as you got farther, more seasoned in your field, did you accept any offers to do law school site inspections for accreditation?
I've done, yes, quite a bit. I enjoyed that. I was never a leader, but I did.
You didn't have the work of being the chair, huh?
That's correct.
You know, I share that with you. I enjoyed just being one of the members that just did my part. But it was fascinating to visit schools. And I used to joke with myself and say, I'll steal all the good ideas. I say, I did.
I can't remember whether it was, I think between 1 and 2 dozen I did during my career. And because of my academic background, I usually had the library section and 1 or 2 other things that I could work on with some perception. That was good. That was a wonderful thing. I did, at one point in time, as we neared the 1990 time, I was starting to feel like I had plateaued a bit in my library work. And so I suggested gently to the dean that maybe there was another colleague who would enjoy doing what I was doing, being an academic contributor as well as a librarian. I assumed there weren't too many people like that, but we did have a colleague who wanted to do that. Her name was Constance Lundberg, and I don't know if you ever met
I
Constance.
remember the name. Oh yeah, I remember Constance.
So we made the switch, and in the very week that we were making the switch, I was attending the annual meetings of the ABA Real Property section, which I was an active member, and was approached by an acquisitions editor of one of the publishers, I think it was Mickey, and asked for my opinion on a couple of people they were thinking of for authors to a major project. And that turned out to be just a guise for asking if I would take over the project. And the project was to update and reissue the Thompson and Real Property set. And so I took it under advisement, consulted with colleagues, and looked it over, and made a proposal that it be totally redone. And the publisher accepted that, and the rest is history.
Hence the Thomas edition of that publication.
It's a bit confusing, isn't it?
Yes, well, it explains why.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a significant treatise in its own right.
I look back on it now, and I did the recruiting, and I did about 70% of it myself. And it was all done in a 2.5-year period. We were on time and under budget, and I was proud of that. But I don't know how it happened now, because I was continued to teach full-time during that time. But that all happened in the year I transitioned out of being a librarian. So I felt somewhat unburdened.
A little less of the other type of day job to be able to devote the efforts, I'm sure, to that kind of a significant undertaking of responsibilities for that publication.
And I'm going to state the obvious here, but since I'm the only person who either wrote as much as I did or has read it cover to cover, or twice because I've edited everybody else's work, the depth and scope of my real property knowledge has been enhanced.
Oh, I imagine.
Incredibly by that experience.
As you say, you wrote the book, or at least edited it, all of it. Yeah. With sort of that, and as we transition towards the end of today's conversation, you know, one of the issues that one hears about more today than in our era was the role of the library director, primarily, and sometimes some of the other librarians. And should they be part of the teaching mission of the school, other than by giving, you know, library service, so something a little more structured or formal? Do you have any thoughts on that? For I know for directors, I imagine you're keen on the idea. You said you wanted to teach over your career, but what about other librarians in the law library? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, a very pertinent question. I've changed a bit on that topic. I now realize that people like me or Constance, who is also a subject matter teacher here, are not abundantly available, and maybe not be the best librarians. I was fully committed to the profession, but I can imagine that a successor of mine who was devoted fully to the academic work might place the library in a secondary position. I'm more comfortable now with a full-time, fully focused library director in the academic setting. And if they participate in their law school faculty as a de facto second-class citizen, that problem can be addressed in other ways. I think they can still be acknowledged for what they are. I was also, as the director, eager for my fellow professionals, like professional librarians. We have a number of dual degree people here. For them making scholarly contributions. And I did not insist that they make their contributions in substantive legal topics. I wanted them to be contributing in the library field. And some of them weren't even really prepared to do that. I think we got a lot of good work coming out of my professionals while I was here, but it wasn't everybody's cup of tea. They could still be a really good librarian without necessarily writing an article for the Journal every year. So I'm more relaxed on that than I used to be.
More flexible, I think, would be the term I would like to use.
And when I started, we were still talking about the library. The library itself is the warehouse of the book, and all of that has totally changed now. We are truly an information science era.
You think the changes that are underway and continue are part of the reason for your reassessment of the teaching role of a librarian?
I think maybe not so much. I couldn't quite see into the future that clearly. It was mostly a personal, subjective decision that I had plateaued.
Okay.
And even if I had stayed in and gone on to significant national office, that comes to an end fairly quickly.
That's right.
You still have to define yourself.
Relatively short period of time that you're in that.
Yeah, so that was not a long-term reason for staying with it. And I discussed it. I didn't have my mind made up on it. I thought it might be worth a try. And it turned out to be the right thing to do in my case. But the role of the director, at least in this past generation, has been, I think, to absorb and take advantage of the technological process as much as possible, and make the. I used to talk about it when technology was first coming. I used to talk about having a library in your lap. That was before there were laptops.
The computers were a tad bit larger in those days, and the screens were not the flat screens we have today. They were the big lead shielded cathode ray tubes.
But sorry, I'm extending this more than you wanted, but the idea was to have at your workstation this wonderful access
Mhm.
to these unlimited resources.
Mhm.
I am delighted that that has basically come to pass now.
Yeah.
And I do most of my round of annual publication work from home. And I don't use research assistants. So, but the library director has to, I think, facilitate that for the students and the faculty here at the law school as the first job. And I'm okay with that.
Okay. Well, that sounds like a good summary of your position as it currently exists and why. Well, David Thomas, it's been delightful talking with you, but another custom is to ask if there's anything as we near the end of today's conversation. Is there anything that we have not discussed that you would like to mention at this point?
This is maybe not relevant to what you want to do, but I think as retirees, we also have to redefine ourselves because so much of our sense of self-worth is tied up in professional accomplishments. And eventually, even in my position, those will diminish. I'm publishing, I'm doing expert witness work, I'm speaking at law conferences, I'm still the acknowledged expert. Two of my books here are Utah Civil Practice and Utah Real Property Law. Those are the only books on those subjects in this state. And so I talk at those conferences. But eventually, I have to be comfortable in my own skin without having those things to feed my ego. And I'm progressing to that point. So
Well,
I'm
that's
very
good.
happy.
I'm not sure I am. I think I did a little backsliding when I took on the role of helping to work on this oral history. But I'm having a marvelous time doing it, so I won't second guess myself quite yet.
As I look at you, Pat, I say, on the road again.
Well, you know, the interesting thing is, you know, you and I are getting a little more on in years, but I have an advantage over a lot of our colleagues in our cohort age-wise. I have a brother-in-law who's 91 now, and every time I'm around Bob, which is my brother-in-law, I feel like a mere kid, and it's a wonderful feeling.
Yeah.
And he's doing pretty well, by the way. I hope maybe I will do as well, even if I get closer to that age, if I don't get quite that far.
Well, that triggers one more comment. When I started here as a 30-year-old, I considered myself the kid.
Yeah.
And when I finished here, I considered myself still the kid. So it's okay.
Well, I guess self-delusion is one of our strong points sometimes as human beings.
I think there's some value in a little humility. So
Very good.
how little of it we have.
Well,
Thank you very much for the opportunity. to talk
Maybe
with you.
on that basis, David Thomas, I want to thank you as well for being part of today's conversation. And I'm thanking you. I'm doing so on behalf of Michelle Wu, Frank Hodak, and Dick Spinelli, our colleagues with whom I have the privilege of working to put together this oral history of law librarianship for the Spinelli's Law Library Reference Shelf portion of Hein Online. Thank you.
Thank you very much.